This is Jeff Speck. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm David Vitézy, the Director General of the Hungarian Museum of Transport. And we are here today because this is an online book launch event of the Hungarian edition of the book 101 Steps to Making Better Places, Walkable City Rules. And here is the Hungarian edition in full Hungarian. So
beautiful.
It's almost the same in size and the content is the same, but the only difference is that it is in Hungarian. So thank you very much for letting us publish it, and hello to this call.
Thank you for having me. I'm extremely grateful that you've published the book in Hungary. I should say, it was really written for an American audience, and it addresses head-on the principal planning, design, urban challenges that we face here in the US. What I've found as I've traveled the world and lectured in lots of different countries is that people are very good at figuring out what aspects apply to them and what aspects don't apply to them. And I imagine that you and your audience also will have the ability to be critical of what's in the book and understand that not only is some of it not applicable, but in fact, there are some things that you might already do better than we do. And we can talk about that. I'm being interviewed next week in the Netherlands. And I asked them, what do you have to learn from me about streets? Because their streets are so much better than ours. I think you need to contextualize it to your own situation. But I would actually be interested in hearing from you a little bit, maybe offline, about what aspects of the book you felt were most useful in a Hungarian context. But certainly a lot of it is universal, especially the parts about shaping spaces and architecture, which I think we all struggle with equally, as opposed to our different national habits surrounding street design, in which we're actually well behind many other places like Europe.
I always try to imagine all the decisions we face in our cities when rearranging public spaces or just allocating funds to be spent on roads or bicycle lanes or public transportation, that we are somehow deciding which way our city is going on a scale from Copenhagen or Amsterdam, or even in public transport spaces somehow from Singapore to the other end of maybe Los Angeles, where there was, I think, endless resources to turn it into a car-centric city. Maybe there was the wish in many cities all around the world to follow this American notion of car-centric urban planning, but maybe because of political will, maybe because of the economic resources, maybe that extent haven't happened in too many places. In a few it had, but not everywhere around the world. So I think that if you look at urban planning and all the questions of daily decisions even in just painting lanes or deciding on a temporary street design when something happens on the street, or major project decisions if you invest in rail or roads, that somehow you are driving the city in some of the directions either way on this scale. And I think that Budapest is, given its history and urban fabric and European history, it may be closer to Copenhagen if we call that one end. But I think that this book is very valuable to a Hungarian audience as well, because it shows the exact guidelines which are the basis of this post-car-centric urban planning all around the world right now. And the examples it takes are mostly from the US, which is, as you said, on this scale, a little bit further down the road to being car-centric as we do. But it shows very well that where these decisions lead if we take that road. So I think that there are examples in the book where I thought when we were translating and we were discussing it, that maybe the local approach is a bit different maybe in transit planning of buses or or I wanted to touch upon the issue of parking, maybe in that sense, or when we look at cycling activism, we asked the largest NGO for cycling, the Hungarian Cycling Club. They are organizing the critical masses here in Budapest. They reviewed the translation, if we used all the terms right. And in some cases, lobbying approach is different in our environment than what is recommended in the book. But we agreed that the general approach is very much the same. And in different urban fabrics, different environments, we have to sometimes use different tools. And in different positions on this scale where our cities are, we have to use different tools to go a little bit further down the road to.
Yeah, there's only one thing. There's only one thing that probably worries me, which is a few of the standards that we fought for. For example, in America, our driving lanes used to be 10 feet wide, so almost exactly 3 meters, right? Then they expanded to 11 feet, 12 feet, and we've now finally gotten certain non-governmental organizations that are trusted to go back to recommending a 10-foot standard. So I do everything I can in the US to sell this 3-meter lane width, but actually there's a lot of cities in Europe where the lanes are narrower than that still.
Yes.
Of course, in residential developments, in lower density developments, in more walkable environments, we have all sorts of different solutions where cars in two directions share a narrow lane, and even smaller standards than that, 10 feet. But in commercial areas in our downtowns, we fight very hard to get 12 or 11 down to 10. In some European cities, 10 would represent an expansion of the roadway. And I want to be very clear that that's not my intention at all. So there are issues like that concern me. But again, I think that you're intelligent enough and flexible enough to understand what's applicable and what isn't. Certainly when it comes to anything surrounding road design, I would say you should turn first to the Dutch and the Scandinavians and the Northern Europeans that are near you before looking to America at all.
How about parking? Because in the book you recommend, and I think that this is something that many urban planners share as a view here as well, that street side parking should be provided wherever it's possible in downtown areas to protect the sidewalk and to make urban downtown shops more approachable. But at the same time, especially in a historic urban fabric in a European city where there is always a lack of public space and there is always a fight for it in a way, parking sometimes seen as not the most efficient way of using your public space, and even sometimes as an incentive to make people drive their cars, because if there is more parking supply, then the demand is growing with it in a way. And this is always a discussion between planners and politicians and decision makers and the press, which is the right way. And this applies not just to street parking, but as well to the parking which is built under new residential areas or new offices. So how do you see parking as a way, especially on-street parking, as a way to share a road in a way that it protects sidewalks and makes it possible for the downtown to survive and for people who have cars to live in the downtown area, or as an inefficient use of public space?
So I think there's a decision tree that you need to go through as you make choices about what to do with the edges of your streets. The first question to ask is, are there viable alternatives to driving in the piece of the city that you're looking at? So if the city is one that has viable public transportation and it's used by many, then, and the shops are not dependent largely on people arriving by car, then that's one type of city in which you don't want to be investing or providing parking at all, perhaps, if you can find other ways to protect the curb. And we'll talk about protecting the curb secondarily. But most American cities are not like that. There are very few exceptions, like parts of Boston and Manhattan and other stuff that that aren't automobile dependent, but the typical American city is quite automobile dependent. So if there are other ways to get around, and it's a viable thing for the majority of society to be getting to a certain street without a car, then anything you do to provide more parking is actually encouraging, as you suggested, is incentivizing driving, and you really don't want to do that. So once you get beyond that question, then the question is, are cars moving quickly in the street? Because if cars are moving quickly, then you need to protect the sidewalk from them. So the next question is, how do you do that? If there's another way to protect the sidewalk, for example, with a buffered, with a bike lane that is itself protected from traffic, whether you do it with trees, whether you do it with vertical barriers of some sort, hopefully attractive, the need for parking is to protect the sidewalk in those places where cars are speeding near the sidewalk. So if there's an alternative, then that may be also viable. It so happens in most American cities, shops are dependent on nearby parking. People are always surprised, though, how many of their shoppers come other ways. Merchants always, in the US, merchants always overestimate the percentage of their shoppers that come by car. You know, they might say 60% of our shoppers are driving when in fact it's 30%. Also, the data shows very clearly that people who bike past a store or walk past a store are much more likely to spend money and more money in the store than people who drive past the store. So there's all these factors and data that we need to take into consideration. But the bottom line is, you know, if the alternatives to driving are not strong, and both, and you need to protect the curb, then the on-street parking is something that we advocate for, which is why, unlike many planners here in the US, because I do so much work in typical American cities, I do typically advocate for more on-street parking. But that's perhaps not the best solution, particularly in the narrow streets of Europe, where you have a limited amount of space and you have a need for a multimodal circumstance where biking is viable and walking and everything else.
Yes, I think we gave a little professional glimpse about what people will find in the book. Let me ask a more personal question, just to make appetite for people to order the book and go on the website and order it, because hopefully many people will see this video who never heard about you or the book, and that's the reason why we translated to Hungarian to make this kind of urbanistic approach accessible, because maybe because of the history of European cities or many other reasons, there aren't too many books, I think, for the European audience of the same kind. There are a lot of very professional, very detailed books, but maybe they are not really interesting for not planners, not engineers, but not these kind of handbooks. Maybe Jan Gale's book is an exception.
I was going to mention Jan Gale. I think he's the European writer who's my spiritual twin.
His books are published in Hungarian as well, and we invited him personally as well to Budapest 2 years ago, and he has a serious influence on this field, I think, locally. So you are an architect, you are an art historian. How did you end up writing books about walkable cities, which is close to architecture, but I think it's another level, and it's very close to what we call transportation policy as well here.
So yeah, I was studying architecture. I studied architecture and architectural history for many years, and I thought I was going to become an architect. It just so happened that in the 1980s, when I was kind of in between college and graduate school, and looking at what was happening in architecture, the stuff that was most fascinating and seemed to have the most potential social impact, as it should, was not at the architectural scale, but was at the urban design scale. And specifically, my attention was drawn to this husband and wife team in Florida, Andres Duani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who had created this new resort village called the town of Seaside. And the town of Seaside was an unprecedented, really, with 50 years of nothing but automotive-centered new towns having been built around the world. The town of Seaside was the first attempt to recreate a traditionally organized village in the United States. You know, for many years, starting at as soon as the Garden City ended, I mean, the Garden City movement was an experiment of its own, but it very much held tight to traditional organizational principles of a community. But subsequent to that, in the early 20th century, the idea was to invent a new model of human settlement that discarded traditional organizational principles. You know, Le Corbusier, the famous French architect and urban planner, said, the street altogether disgusts us, therefore why does it still exist? And then Norman Bell Geddes, a very prominent planner, at the 1939 World's Fair in New York City, GM, General Motors, sponsored this miniature city called Futurama that millions of people saw. And the fundamental principle of Futurama was, and I still never really will understand this, it was in the promotional video, for greater convenience, we were going to separate all the different aspects of human life from each other. We were going to separate living from shopping, from working in different zones of the city for greater convenience. Now, if anyone can explain to me how it's more convenient to have to travel from your home to your work to your, long distances. But this model had taken over, which was zoning, which was separating the city into its parts. And so I grew up in a traditional village, thank goodness, a pre-war suburb. But everything that had been built in the US starting around 1945 was either a housing subdivision, an office park, a shopping mall, or some other, single-use pod. And these places were unlovable because they didn't have that 24-hour, energy that comes from living in a place, working in a place, dining and shopping all in one spot. So I discovered this new town of Seaside, which was an architectural exercise as well, but it basically asked the question, why can't we build new places that are like the old places that we love? And one of the things that was discovered when Andres and Liz created this place was that it was illegal to do it almost anywhere in the US. They had found a strange undeveloped part of the country where the rules weren't there. But when they tried to replicate the concept of creating a traditional village anywhere else in the US, the laws prohibited it. So this whole movement grew out of that, which I joined pretty early on, called the new urbanism. Andres and Liz and I wrote about it in our book called Suburban Nation, which came out in 2000, but it really represented thinking for them from the 80s, and said, why can't we make great places again that are truly mixed use, walkable, livable? And that's how I got turned on to this movement.
I think this really explains why it makes sense to publish your book in Hungarian, because even if you look around in downtown Budapest, it feels very different from a typical American city built after this era. But if you look at this situation that the current rules wouldn't let us build what we enjoy in our lives, in our cities, this is something very similar. And I think that Budapest as well, even if it's a Central Eastern European city, and thankfully we didn't have enough resources and maybe enough political courage in a way to destroy our historic neighborhoods. And when the wave from Futurama and everything what happened in the US arrived to first the Soviet Union, and it turned into a socialist urban planning approach, and then arrived from that direction to Budapest. At that time, what happened was that they poured asphalt from door to door, from wall to wall, and everything what was between the historic walls of the historic buildings became a space for cars, for parking, or for lanes and pedestrians, and even trams were discontinued on some major routes. All the space were given for cars. But the historic fabric wasn't demolished, and if Budapest is a lovely place and one of the most beautiful cities in the world, it's because of this historic fabric of the city. And even today, you wouldn't get a building permit for that kind of houses because you can't build enough parking underneath. They don't have any parking, and so on. So I think these kind of urban policies, which we still use in our cities and in our lives, even in the most public transport and centric and most walkable European cities, because in Budapest, every 6 trips out of 10 are made by public transport. So that's a very high share. But still, the building code and many of our regulations and what we think is natural in urban planning, it still comes from even Futurama or that kind of dream of car-centric cities where all the distances are designed for cars and not for people to get around. So I think this is really why looking at American examples and look at the cities where this logic were applied in a larger scale and in cities which were built from scratch decades ago, following this logic, and how they could turn a little bit back from that approach today and these days, and following the new urbanism movement. I think this is something which we should look at and learn from. And this is why
very instructive. It's very instructive to look at images of Amsterdam from the 60s, where the streets look very much like, as you described, asphalt from wall to wall, full of cars. They made a decision then, which we still haven't made yet, that they were going to turn away from that model. And there are wonderful side-by-side images that you can show before and after of the 1960s streets and even 10, 20 years ago, the same street, full of, instead of cars, full of bikers and pedestrians and maybe a tram and some cars. And that commitment to a multimodal city, which is equitable, and this distribution of space among the different modes is fully possible. And thank goodness you retained your historic fabric as well as they did. I think it's important to understand a fundamental thing about the shape of cities and the way that derives from transport. The demands of the automobile for space and speed are unquenchable. You can't actually, because of, it literally takes 2,000 privately owned vehicles, privately owned cars, to bring as many people in and out of Manhattan as a single L train, right? A single subway. And when you do the math and compare that to buses, which are in between, and ferries and other ways of getting around, and of course the spatial demands of bicycles, which are so small, and walking, which is the tightest, you learn very quickly that if cities thrive based on their ability to bring people together, which is why they exist, right? And that density and that propinquity, that closeness, is what generates value in cities, that any instrument that causes you to spread out is going to be destroying your economic engine. And that's precisely what automobiles do, because their demands for space, particularly if you want to keep moving at any regular speed, and the gaps that spread out as cars go faster, they get more far apart, that actually it's completely destructive to creating an energetic and economically strong city, to have everyone arriving in it by private vehicle. Moreover, the demands of fitting and parking those vehicles, the investment that you have to make to satisfy that is extremely huge. So then the second thing is that when I say it's unquenchable, the experience we've had in the US, I'm sure you're aware of, is we continue to add lanes and add parking in order to satisfy this demand, but that induces more demand. And there's this term that well, it's one of the rules in the book to understand and to fight induced demand. it's a discussion of how the principal constraint to driving in congested systems is that very congestion that people resent. The only thing that stops people from driving more is the congestion. They're making the decision to drive or not based on cost, not based on some other factor, but on whether they're going to get stuck in traffic. And so in the typical dense city that has congestion, when you remove parking and put in a driving lane, when you narrow the sidewalks, remove the street trees, put in another driving lane, when you tear down a building and put in more parking, all of those things that you would hope would alleviate the congestion that you're trying to solve just invites in more vehicles. And as Jan Gehl himself said, what we learned in the 20th century is that cars are like water and your city's a bucket. And if you make the bucket bigger, it's just going to fill with more water. That's absolutely been the circumstances that we've experienced. Cities need to decide what they want to be. What kind of city do we want to have? And then allow cars to inhabit it to the degree that it makes sense within that model. But if you allow satisfying the car to be your objective, you will fail to create a successful city and you will gut your city. Lewis Mumford knew that as early as the middle of the last century. So it's an important argument to understand. It's also important to understand who drives and who doesn't. We have this unfortunate circumstance in that the people who make decisions in our cities are naturally the powerful, and the powerful tend to be wealthier, and the wealthier tend to drive. And so you have circumstances like in Mexico City, for example, where 80% of the people come into the city by public transport, but they're investing all this money in infrastructure for the 20% that arrive by car. Why? Not because the rich are evil, but because the people who plan cities tend to see cities through their own experience. It's what Jarrett Walker, who's a transport planner, he calls it elite projection, that we can't help but see the city through our own experience. And if our experience is driving, then of course we're going to design the city around that. And that's not serving the majority of the people. And in a city like Budapest or other older European cities, you have the great walkable infrastructure. You have the potential for great bikeable infrastructure if you don't have it already. You have these tremendous legacy transit systems. And the idea that anyone needs to be driving is kind of preposterous. So you need to create a framework for people to make the clear economical proper choices. And that's why Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota, says the mark of a developed nation is not that poor people have cars, but that rich people are taking public transportation.
Yes. Budapest, I think it's quite lucky, but not just because that the majority of people are using public transportation in their daily lives. This year is quite special, but how after the first wave of the pandemic, public transportation bounced back in the summer, and almost 80% of the last year's ridership came back between the two waves of the pandemic in the summer. I think it shows that the strength of public transportation in the daily life of Budapest is very strong, and this has a political impact for sure, even if there is some kind of elite projection always. But I think that that this is an important fact. But on top of this, in the last 20 years, because of congestion, because of air quality, and because of a lot of activism in the transport field, I started my career as well as a public transport activist, always trying to fight for better buses and night buses and trams. So I think that generally there is no one really saying that we shouldn't invest in public transportation, but if we see congestion, instead we invest in roads. That's out of question. And I think that in the investment of public transportation, that it's the top one priority in transport policy, especially for rail and trams and so on. I think there is almost total agreement in the urban policy professional field and in the political field as well. Maybe there are differences in projects, which is more important, this or that, but it's generally all public transport. In terms of public spaces, it's always an easier thing to change because it's a lot cheaper than building a new metro line or rail line. but it's always as well a lot more sensitive to, take away a car lane or just take away a parking space. So this is always a very sensitive issue here as well. And I wanted to ask you about what has changed since you published this book, or you wrote this book, I think 2 years ago, right? In the US and globally. And when I was thinking about this, I found two important matters. One is clearly the pandemic, that we are in the middle of a second wave right now. When we are talking, I think in the US as well in Europe. And clearly it had an impact on our cities, and maybe the hopes how it will change the urban fabric were higher in March or April than they are now. But I think they will have long-lasting impacts because of the fact that we are now talking to each other from our homes right now, and how this changed the whole conference travel and daily office work environment, and because maybe how we think about our public spaces and our daily commutes as well. So I wanted to ask your opinion about that. And the second thing I found when I was thinking about this was a non-pandemic issue. All these talks are now about the pandemic, so I found another topic which is important: the emergence of micromobility on its current scale. Even in Budapest, where they were non-visible a few years, even 1 year ago, now you can see all these e-scooters lying all around, and even the most progressive advocates of sustainable mobility sometimes are saying that they shouldn't belong here, and this is an unsustainable mode of transportation. And other people think, I share this view, that any trip which are moved into a human-sized way, human-sized electric vehicle, it's better than a motorized one. So I wanted to ask your view about that as well.
Yeah, so I'll get micromobility out of the way first. That argument that you describe, I have not heard here. There's very little conversation about the negatives of e-scooters, for example, except surrounding the fact that there's inadequate infrastructure for them, and so people are riding on the sidewalk and endangering people. Of course, like bicycles on the sidewalk, e-scooters on the sidewalk are proportionally injuring and killing an infinitesimally small number, a statistically insignificant number of people. I'm sorry if it's someone you know, but the fact is that there's been a lot of overblown conversation, as there has been for years, about the danger of bicyclists to pedestrians, when in fact, compared to the blood that is daily spilled from automobiles, it's negligible. So the only real lesson that we've learned is that the more alternatives we have for micro mobility, including e-bikes, which have really caught on, as opposed to just typical bikes, human-powered bikes, is that we do need to provide infrastructure for them. So most planners that I know, myself included, are excited about the e-scooters and the electric skateboards and the e-bikes and everything else that are taking off, because they put more pressure on municipalities to provide bike lanes. And now we call bike lanes micromobility lanes, if that's appropriate. And we understand there's really three parts of a busy street, right? It's important to remember that our typical smaller scale urban street is a slow speed environment in which everyone can mix very slowly, and that's okay. But if you have a street that's a major throughway with a lot of traffic on it, or a major commercial street, then you do need your car component, if you have that at all, and your pedestrian component, and in between or somewhere allocated, you need that micro mobility component that would include scooters and other things. So we see that as a positive thing. And I read something very interesting the other day, which was that one study showed that people who own e-bikes get as much exercise as people who own normal bikes. They just go further and faster. So this initial mythology that I was buying into, which is that e-bikes aren't very healthy, is actually not in terms of the pandemic, I think a few interesting things have come out. The first is that I don't know about in Europe, but the initial message we were hearing in the US, particularly from the usual suspects, from the folks who work for the think tanks that are funded by oil, gas, coal, concrete, and home building, is that the city was dead. That the pandemic has spread first and fastest in our big cities, which, by the way, is where the airplanes landed and where the people were conferencing, right? And that cities were dangerous and bad, and like in Boccaccio's Decameron, the only safe thing to do to flee the plague was to go out into the countryside. The data now from the U.S. is very clear. I'm not sure if you've seen it, that it's absolutely flipped. That now per capita, the most dangerous places to be in our country are rural areas, and then secondarily is small towns, and then third, small cities. And the more dense and urban your place is, the safer you are, because actually there are certain standards and protocols and framework for living more healthy in cities as opposed to places that lack urban infrastructure. So we were afraid at first that this pandemic and the fear of its continuing or future pandemics was going to drive people away from cities. Certainly that popular opinion still exists, but the data is countervailing, and I think eventually people will come to understand that suburban life or rural life is not the solution. Secondarily, as you alluded to, certain cities have taken advantage of the pandemic to make changes that are necessary to fight the real long-term crisis of climate change. And so you see mayors like Hidalgo in Paris and Sadiq Khan in London, and other places like Barcelona making huge commitments to green up their infrastructure, to close streets to cars, or at least make them not through streets. These mayors and these cities are very forthright about saying, we need to take advantage of the reduced traffic from the pandemic to make the changes to our streets that we know we need to become more sustainable cities. That's happened more in some cities than others. I don't have a great hope that it will be changing cities in the US all that much, mostly because we're just so stupid on climate, if I can say that. But it's certainly, there's kind of two countervailing tendencies. One is that people, as you suggested, will have less need to office. And so some of the heat that's on our city centers, all these people coming in at the same time every day, might be lifted. On the other hand, people, at least here, are afraid to take public transportation. That will go away when the virus goes away. Unfortunately, our public transportation funding has dropped in such a way that many of our systems are being deteriorated that could have permanent impacts. So that's a real problem. You say that people, that public transportation picked back up in Budapest, and that's a great sign of people's choices. But in fact, a traditional city like Budapest or Boston, where I live, it simply can't sustain itself if the people who were on public transportation start driving. I mean, the roads aren't wide enough, and making them wider won't help. So it really isn't a choice that people have. One is hopeful, and we've been getting great news every week about vaccines, that this will be over before too long, that the only long-lasting impact it should have on our cities, which we cherish and need, would be perhaps more openness to a variety of urban forms that we've been afraid to implement prior.
Yes, public transportation, I think, should bounce back and have to bounce back, because otherwise our cities won't operate and won't be able to survive, really. We were just discussing a few days ago with in a roundtable with a few other cities that how public transportation revenues and the business model of public transportation could be impacted. Budapest, I think, it's quite lucky in that field, because most of the local people buy unlimited ride monthly or annual passes. And even if you work home after the pandemic, 1 day more or 2 days more than zero, what was the usual here, then still it will make sense for you to buy this unlimited monthly pass, because it still will be cheaper than buying single tickets all the time when you commute. So I hope that the business model of public transportation wouldn't change, even if the people who can work from home, it's the minority of people still. and it won't change that much because there are a lot of jobs where you have to go and in a hospital or in commerce or in many other fields, you have to be there in person. So we hope that the general ridership and business model of public transportation won't change in the long term, and the pandemic showed clearly that there is more appetite for I would say, I use this term, that human-sized vehicles, which I include scooters and bicycles and e-bikes and even electric scooters as well, all the different kinds of micromobility and personal small vehicles, because the demand for them clearly grew a lot this year, and you see these e-scooters everywhere. Yes, it's interesting that it's not an issue in the US, maybe because where there are good sidewalks, they are wider than here. But here, the major criticism towards these scooters is that they are lying around and they left around when people don't use them. And clearly there is regulation for that. Lisbon did a very good new rule for that. Then you have these parking spots for them in every corner, and you can leave them there. But generally, I think that the emergence of these easily rented new transport modes is a good, as you said, opportunity for our cities. Let me ask one last question, or raise one last topic, because it's an interesting discussion in the professional world right now. That you mentioned the mayor of Paris, and her program was the 15-minute city, and we hear about this a lot right now, that 15 or 20-minute cities should become reality. I think that in historical European cities, they are somehow a reality, not a full reality, and it as all the jobs won't come to your neighborhood, it won't be a full reality ever. But this notion of compact cities somehow became as a counterpoint to improving public transportation and rail in a regional level. And when this comes up, I always take the example of Paris, where they at the same time try to turn the historic downtown of Paris, which is quite a large downtown area, into a compact 15-minute city, but at the same time they invest enormous amount of money into providing rail as the primary mode of transportation in all kinds of suburban areas around Paris, not just the imminent ones, but even the ones which are 100 kilometers away from the French capital. So I think that if we have a suburban sprawl in some way, which we have in most of our cities, certainly we have it in Budapest, we have 1.5 million people living around the 1.7 million city, and it's growing. And it's growing not just because people move out, but because of real estate prices. People who move into the city find their first homes in the area around the city. So this means that there is a demand there. And currently, while 6 people out of 10 use public transportation in Budapest, only 3 or maximum 4 out of 10 are using public transportation when they are commuting from the suburban region. So to improve public transportation for them, I think it's really the only way to reach a real result in fighting climate change, local air quality, all the health problems which are caused by car traffic in the city, because there is a lot of market potential there. That is the market where public transportation has most potential. And I believe, and I wanted to ask your opinion about this, I strongly believe that there is no contradiction between a compact city and a suburban region where public transportation connects the different smaller compact cities in the region and the larger compact cities in the central area. Do you share this view, or do you think there is some kind of contradiction here?
Well, I think there's a contradiction in the US because we've developed too much of our property, of our land, in spread out, single use, completely unwalkable, unbikeable pods that are too low density to be served at the micro scale by public transportation. But you look to other places like, Switzerland, which is a principally rural mountainous country where you can get everywhere on public transportation. In Zurich, you can zip around, and then to get out to somewhere in the countryside, there's a bus that goes there. And it has to do with the localized design of the community. And when I hear 15-minute city, I think that's great. I've been spending most of my career designing 5-minute cities in the sense that we use a neighborhood model. The new urbanism has developed this early 20th century concept that grew out of the village, that grew out of the Garden City movement, and even Ebenezer Howard, right, at the turn of the century, that most of your daily needs should be within walking distance. And we define convenient walking distance as 5 minutes. So a typical neighborhood, and we when we design greenfield projects, when we design new projects on open land, we use this unit. That's the neighborhood unit. It's less than a kilometer across because it's a 5-minute walk from edge to center. And we plan in those increments. And while, yes, you may need a vehicle, and ideally it's a transit vehicle, to get to your job or to get to a hospital or a university or some other district that's more intense within the larger metropolis, most of your daily needs, the school, the shop, the soccer field, the football field, those are all within walking distance. The problem in the US and in so many of the other places that have emulated our 20th century urban model is that the typical household, technically, if you want to build a new subdivision in the United States, you have to size your roadways around each individual household generating 13 car trips per day. 13 one-way car trips per day as the average that we generate, because we're not just driving to work and back, we're driving to school and back, we're driving to sports and back, we're driving to the corner store to get cat food, right, that we should be able to walk to. So what's essential when you look at the larger metropolis and the fact that people are still building suburbs is to identify a model for suburb building that's much more village-based rather than sprawl-based. And that understand that when presented with a piece of property that is to be developed, a developer has a framework that we've defined in the new urbanism very clearly. We have codes that do this. We have one you can look up online called the SMART code. If you Google the SMART code, which show you how to lay out properties in a way that most of your daily needs are within that 5-minute block. And that idea of compact, localized growth, even if it's principally single-family homes, that can support transit in a way that sprawling single-use growth can't, but still allow people a lovely suburban lifestyle.
Yes, and I think that the Dutch are giving an especially good example for that, in a way that there are suburban areas which are not very dense. They meet, I think, the criteria that there are services around them, and you don't have to own a car just to live there. But when you need to go to the major city around you, any major city of Holland, then you can take your bicycle to the railway station. There is a safe route, and then you can take the train and get into the city, and maybe take another bicycle in Amsterdam or any other city and use it there. So we feel that the walkability and cyclability of these suburban areas around the stations and the residential areas around them, which is very often just looked upon because it's not an issue for most of the activism, because that's mostly focusing on the downtown area and the most important historic and most significant places in the city. This is as important as the core is. So this is, I think, that this is the key to solve this artificial issue that compact city or a good public transportation based,
but also in terms of
could be imagined.
In terms of improving sustainability and economic success, smart cities will subsidize housing downtown. Because it's too expensive to live downtown for many people, your city will benefit if you actually invest as a municipality in providing attainably priced housing downtown, because then there'll be so many other benefits that come from that your tax base will improve in such a way that you can afford it.
In a way, we already subsidize it with with almost free parking for downtown residents, but maybe that's not the
That's
right
not what
way
I
of subsidizing it, because then it incentivizes car use. But a new idea, which is not a new idea at all, because it was always in the long-term plans, but now it somehow becomes a part of taxation here, is that there are some extensive brownfield areas very close to the downtown, which were used by railways and industry 50, 100 years ago, and now they are fully abandoned. And just on a market basis, they aren't used for building new apartments and new residential areas, because they are too expensive to clear up. And now there will be some tax incentives, because they are already served well with public transportation, because the industries and railway stations which were there were served by public transport, and they could be a lot more dense and downtown-ish than any suburban area. So there's a lot to do, and locally, even if Budapest has great figures in sustainable transportation, walking, cycling, public transportation, we still have a lot to do, and we are always looking at different examples all around the world to learn from and to shape our thinking. And we will distribute this book to all the universities learning architecture, urbanism, transportation policies, and all the decision makers who are making decisions in smaller towns or the capital city or the government about transportation. So it will get into the hands to everyone, I can promise you that,
That's great.
Who can make use of it, and everyone else who would like to order a copy, they can do that on our website, which I hopefully will be the address here under me now as we discuss about it on the final video. So Jeff, thank you very much for this discussion. I hope very much that after the pandemic we can invite you to Budapest in person as well, and to meet all the people who will read this book in Hungarian as well until then.
Well, I would enjoy that tremendously. I would enjoy working on those brownfield sites with you, if that's possible. I would direct people also to my website, which is jeffspeck.com, and you can spell that out if you like for your audience. And the website has a lot of great projects. It also has 2 TED Talks that I believe you can have translated. I believe that there's translation into Hungarian for those talks. But those are 2 15-minute talks that cover these topics really quickly and clearly, that might also be of use to your audience.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.